also in that New York Times interview, Donald Trump decided to, well, he said that he was going to keep an open mind with regard to climate change. He said, well, in the chat, Tom Friedman of the New York Times asked Trump would he withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. And he said, quote, I'm looking at it very closely. I have an open mind to it. Now, this in itself may seem minor, but he's getting ready to be the president of the United States. And we are at a very pivotal time with regard to climate change. It may not even be pivotal anymore. We may just be beyond the pale, right? And we might just be trying to stop the future hemorrhaging. But considering where he's come from, this is actually tremendous progress. And it's not as depressing as when he said that climate change is a quote unquote hoax. He's had every position imaginable on climate change, Donald Trump. And it's super important that we understand what the future president of the United States is going to do on climate change, because out of everything we're discussing, that's one of the few things, one of the handful of issues that affects every single person, no matter where you are, no matter how much you make. And it affects, you know, of course, there is a disproportionate effect on poor neighborhoods, poor communities. But the Washington Post did a brilliant job with a paper, with an article. And they said, but basically, what's Donald Trump's position on climate change? Quote, all of them. And they listed item by item where Donald Trump has been on every side of the conversation on climate change. And one of those, let's just go through them, right? There's only so many permutations that you could have of positions on climate change. So let's go. And it seems that Donald Trump has found a way to have all of them. All right. So at the end of 2009, Trump, with his children and some of his business leaders, colleagues, they sent a letter and called for Congress and President Obama to take, quote, urgent action and to, quote, invest in a clean energy economy that would spur economic growth, create new jobs, and increase our energy security while reducing the harmful emissions that are putting our planet at risk. Here, Donald Trump. We like that version. We like that version of Donald Trump on climate change, at least. So a few months later, when he was asked about climate change on Fox News, the Washington Post outlines that he told Neil Cavuto, that the cold weather in January was an indicator that there was no climate change. You remember the senator who had a snowball on the Senate floor and said, what climate change? All right, so he's held a reasonable position and an absolute absurd position. Then he said, quote, I am not a great believer in man-made climate change. I'm not a great believer in it, he told the Washington Post during a sit-down during the primaries. So he believed in climate change, but he didn't believe that it was man-made. Then later on, he said he denied that climate change was happening, called it a hoax. He suggested that the world is actually warming, but humans aren't involved in that warming. He suggested that the world is warming and that humans had a, quote, minor effect on the warming. He suggested that the world is warming and that there is some connectivity, quote unquote, connectivity to human behavior. And then he called for the adoption of policies to curtail human-caused climate change, providing a boon to the economy. And we can all never forget the world-famous climate change. I've mentioned it, but I have to add this to it. Climate change is a hoax perpetrated by China. Donald Trump has been on every side of the issue with regard to climate change. One of the most, if not the most important issues of our day. And it seems, I don't know, maybe he's come full circle. Here we are. He's back at it. He's come full circle, and he's saying that he's going to at least keep an open mind about it. We'll see. We'll see what that actually means.